At number 8, Spartacus. At one point, a group of Roman slaves revolted, and though they eventually lost their battle, they survived a pretty long time thanks to one famous slave named Spartacus. Spartacus was a slave who escaped a gladiatorial training camp and recruited thousands of other slaves to fight for their freedom alongside him. For the slaves, Spartacus was their symbol of hope and their leader. This slave army was able to defy Roman authorities for 2 years with freedom in their sights, but unfortunately those dreams were crushed when Roman general Crassus crushed Spartacus and his army. After Spartacus was killed, the authorities came for the rest of the slaves in the army and they were severely punished. 6,000 slaves who took part in the revolt were crucified, and this was almost a warning to the other slaves against trying to revolt again. Spartacus became a legend, but it wasn't enough to free the Roman slaves.
Number 7. Second-class citizen. You may have heard this term thrown around a little bit, but becoming a citizen of Rome was kind of a big deal. Your social status kind of defined how you lived. You'd think being a slave sweating away in the Mediterranean sun wasn't bad enough. There was a lot of red tape to go with this as well. So many rules. When freeing slaves, no more than 100 at a time could be freed. Okay, but I have a few issues with that. If your house has 100 slaves, you probably ain't gonna give up 100 in the first place. Now the rule says under no circumstances can you free 100 slaves at one time. Okay, what if you break it up? Say you do 50 at a time. What if you do 99 slaves and leave one until later? What if you release one at 11:59 and then the rest at midnight? What if some of the slaves are missing limbs from hard labor and only count as half? Let's say you release 99 and one half slaves at 11:59 and the last half at midnight. You see what I'm saying? There's too many rules. I can't deal with that, man. Too many rules. No. Number 6, foundation. Okay, everyone loves Rome. Who doesn't? You got your legions, you got your colosseums, you got your aqueducts. Oh, it's a big deal. As it turns out, the Romans were good at building stuff. Most impressive, honestly, was their roads. I know that's not as cool as the buildings, but trust me, anyone who actually knows architecture in the comments is gonna quietly nod their head and agree with me, and so yeah, he's right, actually, yeah. Roman roads last 2,000 years. Toronto is still waiting for the Edmonton Crosstown. That's a local inside joke, but trust me, it'll slap. Where the hell is that thing? Come on. The point I'm getting at is Romans built a lot of great stuff, and it could not have been so without the efforts of the many slaves who built their roads, tended their farms, and did just about everything. Honestly, it was built on the whole thing. Number 5, collars. Collars were made for animals, dogs, cattle. No one likes wearing them. Well, maybe except a certain anthropomorphic community, that is. You know the one I'm talking about. Sadly though, Roman slaves did wear collars, similar to dog tags in the military. It's a form of identification, and you know that said person is a slave, which in case you didn't know was super uncool. Anyone who says otherwise is just off, or if I had to take a guess, they're the same people who would choose to side with Caesar's Legion in Fallout New Vegas. You know gosh darn well that the NCR is the right choice, and or also leading the Las Vegas Strip by yourself. I mean, come on, who doesn't want to be the CEO of 3 luxurious casinos in the Mojave Wasteland? But I digress. The collars are naughty. They're bad. Don't do that. Especially the explosive ones. I don't like it. Number 4, currency. There's something that just tickles my fancy when thinking about Roman gold coins. Maybe it's my inner historian, or maybe it's because my persona is Wario. Wario likes gold. Can't blame me. However, the Roman denarius is not what we're talking about right now. I'm talking about the ancients' other favorite currency, flesh and bone. Unfortunately for the slaves of Rome, they were traded, bought, and sold like an item, or used as a currency. When you build a whole society around such a horrible thing, this just kind of makes sense. It adds up. To make bad things even worse, sometimes when Rome was expanding or the Gauls got a little too close to Rome and some borders were being exchanged, it often meant that some slaves would change hands too. And by that, I mean they were taken and put to work for another boss that was probably less nice to them since they didn't come from the same area. Boy, history sure is mean sometimes. I tell you, that history, oh boy.
At number 3, fugitives. As you can imagine, life as a slave in ancient Rome or at any period of time wasn't easy. Living conditions were poor, it was dangerous, and no one should ever be treated like that or used for free labor. Many slaves have been known to escape, and obviously the same went for those in ancient Rome. Slaves running away from their masters was a common thing back then, and to deal with it, slave owners would hire professional slave catchers to hunt down, capture, and return the escaped slave back to their owner. For slave owners who wanted to take matters into their own hands, they would advertise rewards for those who could return their slaves, or they would just try and locate their slave themselves. Some slave owners had ways of preventing their slaves from getting away, like using collars with instructions on where to return the escaped slave, much like a dog collar, which is just dehumanizing. At number 2, revolts. In Roman times, slave revolts were pretty common. There have been a number of recorded slave revolts in Roman history. I mentioned the one that was led by Spartacus, but there's another pretty famous Roman slave revolt that was led by a man named Eunice. Eunice led a revolt that happened in Sicily from 135 to 132 BCE. It is said that Eunice believed himself to be a prophet and claimed to have several mystical visions. Eunice was able to persuade a number of other slaves to follow him when he performed a trick where sparks and flames came out of his mouth. They believed that he was magical, and so they followed him to try and fight back against the Roman forces. Unfortunately, they were defeated, but the example that they set is believed to have inspired yet another slave revolt in Sicily later in 104 to 103 BCE. And finally, at number 1, totally normal. Probably the most messed up thing about life as a Roman slave was just how normal slavery was in society. I mean, the Roman people were so invested in their slaves that they continuously tried to crush their revolts, and they tried everything in their power to keep them from escaping. Even the sheer number of slaves that were in their society just shows how important slavery was to them. Back then, slavery was just an unquestioned institution. For many, it was just a normal part of life, which is actually quite frightening when you think about it. There is no recorded history of Romans ever questioning slavery in their society, and all economic, legal, and social forces in Rome at this time worked hard to try and preserve slavery as part of their society. To the ancient Romans, slaves were seen as the direct opposite of free people, which they believed was a necessary balance that they needed in their society. They never completely got rid of slavery either. Though they did try and create new rules and laws to make life as a slave more bearable, they were still bought and sold into servitude and were seen as property and lesser people.
Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have Spartacus and the Third Servile War. To start this list off, we have to go back to one of the largest slave revolts in history. Spartacus was a Thracian gladiator who commanded a massive slave army during the Third Servile War. The uprising began in 73 BC when Spartacus, along with a small group of slaves, escaped from gladiator training. As they moved, they gained momentum, with other enslaved people from across the Roman countryside coming to join them in their revolt. Of course, wind ended up getting back to the Roman Senate, and they were rightfully concerned considering how this revolt had defeated not only a militia at Mount Vesuvius, but also 2 other legions near Mount Garganus. It is said that while this revolt gained massive numbers, the slaves later fell victim to disunion. The group ended up splitting off into several smaller groups, everything was disorganized, and this ultimately led to their demise. The main rebellion was defeated in 71 BC after Marcus Licinius Crassus, commanding 8 Roman legions, cornered Spartacus and defeated what remained of his army. Spartacus lost his life in this battle, and the remaining 6,000 slaves met their fate as they were crucified along a Roman highway as a warning against future revolts. In our number 9 spot today, we have the Andrew Rebellion. This is one of the largest revolts in United States history, and it started on January 8, 1811, when a man named Charles Deslandes led an organized rebellion of enslaved people. He traveled through the German coast of the Mississippi River, which was a region along the west bank of the Mississippi River that was primarily settled by German immigrants, and as he traveled, his group grew to somewhere around an estimated 200 revolters. Within 2 days, however, countergroups began to form and began attacking. They targeted enslaved men at the Destrehan plantation and killed an estimated 40 people who were seeking freedom. Some of the others were captured and later executed, which has led researchers to believe that somewhere around a total of 95 people who were seeking their freedom were killed by these countergroups during this revolt, and of course some of this was done in a public way so as to discourage others from attempting the same sort of thing. As for the leader of the revolt, Charles, well, he was never tried or put in jail. Instead, one of those against him described the extremely grim fate that he had met at the hands of those trying to oppose him. In our number 8 spot today, we have the Stono Rebellion. On September 9th, 1739, a group of 20 enslaved people met near the Stono River in South Carolina. This rebellion had been planned for this day, and to start off with, the group stopped at a firearm depot where they took the life of the owner and armed themselves for what was to come. They marched from here, headed to Florida with a sign that said Liberty. The exact details of this entire revolt are quite murky in the history books because of the fact that there was only ever one first-hand account, so it isn't quite clear who was leading this group. Some say it was a man named Cato, others say a man named Jemmy. The group continued on their journey, and as they went, they took the lives of enslavers and burned their homes. Within 10 miles, however, the group was found by a white militia group. Those searching for freedom were decapitated in front of other enslaved people, which was meant meant to serve as a warning. In the end, it has been recorded that 21 white people and 44 black people were killed during the Stono Rebellion.
At number 6, freedom. Earlier I mentioned that Roman slaves had the chance to buy their freedom. It was a lengthy process, but this gave a lot of slaves hope for a better life. Things weren't always better after buying their freedom though, and many of them sold themselves back into slavery because things were tough. The process of buying your freedom as a slave was called manumission. This could be achieved in a number of ways. Slave master could grant their slave freedom as a reward for their service and loyalty. The slave could pay their master a sum of money to be freed, or sometimes a slave master could just find it convenient to let their slave go. Most slave masters who chose that last option to free their slave for their own benefit were merchants who needed someone to be able to sign contracts on their behalf, and since slaves weren't allowed to represent their masters from a legal standpoint, they would be freed, but would still work for their master. You also had to be over the age of 30 to buy your freedom, so if you were lucky to live that long, then there was hope of being freed, but with the average life expectancy in ancient Rome being about 28 years or so, and with the living conditions of many slaves, they would be lucky to get that opportunity. At number 5, demand. In ancient Rome, there was an incredibly high demand for slaves, but since there were so many slaves in Rome, there was always work for them. Oftentimes, people sold themselves or their children into slavery in order to pay off their debts, so when it came to being bought, that came pretty easy. Other than public office, slaves were used for almost every activity in ancient Rome. The most common slave trade was mining because workers were always in demand, mostly due to the high level of danger that came with the job, and the fact that many slaves were injured or died while working in the mines, and slave masters needed to keep replacing those who could no longer work. Domestic labor and farming were also high demand jobs for slaves back then. Back then, the logic behind using slave labor for these types of jobs was that, quote, free labor should be used in unhealthy places, end quote. Basically, they believed that it was better to have a slave pass away on the job than a free person because it would impact their business less. At number 4, procurement. The way that slaves were acquired in ancient Rome was pretty messed up, I will say. Typically, slaves were acquired through 4 different ways. They would be brought in as war captives, as victims of pirate raids, by trade, or by breeding. During the early expansion of the Roman Empire, many war captives were turned into slaves. The pirates from Sicilia, located in what is now modern-day Turkey, did business with the Romans and supplied them with a lot of their slaves. The pirates would bring their slaves to the island of Delos, which back then was considered to be the international center of slave trading. The slave trade was such a big deal back then that it has been recorded that on at least one occasion, 10,000 people were traded as slaves and shipped back to Italy in one day. This was a big business opportunity for a lot of people, but of course no one ever considered the lives of the people they were buying and selling.
In our number 3 spot today we have the Zanj Rebellion. This uprising began in 869 AD when Zanj slaves joined with a revolutionary in order to rise up against the Abbasid Caliphate. Zanj is an Arabic term that was used at the time to describe East Africans, and this uprising was started by all the false promises of land and freedom, and to start they began by raiding nearby cities at night to gather supplies and also to liberate others in the same position. They started small, but the numbers grew quickly, and this turned into a revolution that lasted for 15 years. It turned into more than just a revolt against slavery, it turned into a battle of rich against poor. They even gathered a navy and began to control cities in what is now modern-day Iraq. The revolution ended in the 880s after the empire's army mobilized and conquered the rebel city. While many lost their lives in battle, there also were many whose lives were spared, and some were apparently even invited to join the empire's military. In our number 2 spot today we have the 1733 St. John insurrection. In 1733, on the Danish-owned island of St. John, most of the slaves there were part of the Akan, which is an African people from what is now modern-day Ghana. In November of 1733, as they were plagued with illness and drought and all of the other horrors that come with being enslaved, a group of higher-ranking Akans began their rebellion plans. Things officially began when the group of slaves used weapons that they had smuggled to kill several of the Danish soldiers that sat inside of a plantation called Coral Bay. After this, another 150 people joined the revolution and did similar things at the island's other plantations, which led to them taking command of most of the island. They then planned to claim the island and all of the valuable farmland, but this didn't last for very long. After 6 months of rule, in May of 1734, hundreds of French troops arrived to the island and violently ended the rebellion. After this, it wasn't until over a century later that slavery was abolished in the Danish West Indies. In our number 1 spot today, we have the Baptist War. This revolt started as a peaceful protest, but it ended in a bloody battle. On Christmas Day in 1831, somewhere around 60,000 of the 300,000 enslaved people in Jamaica went on a general strike. Inspired by the abolitionist movement in Great Britain and under the direction of Baptist preacher and slave Samuel Sharp, they vowed not to return to their jobs unless awarded their basic freedoms and a living wage. This peaceful strike carried on until rumors spread that British colonists planned to stop the strike by force. Of course, this is what led to the strike turning into a rebellion. The slaves burned and looted plantations for days, but the loss of life was great. By the time the British colonial army was put into action and they stopped the revolt, 300 slaves and 14 enslavers had been killed. This was not the end of the loss of life, however, as after this 300 more slaves, including Sam Sharp, were killed due to their involvement. While this may seem as though it was an unsuccessful revolt, the effects were felt far and wide. Only 1 year later, the British Parliament would abolish slavery in the British Empire.
Number 10. Population. Here's the thing, folks. When you do the whole slave thing, you may need more than one. Maybe 2. Okay, 10 tops, no more than that. Okay, maybe like thousands. Yes, this was true of ancient Rome. While it is difficult to calculate the exact number of people who were slaves, some historians speculate that at least 10% of the population were slaves. And if that number doesn't feel right to you, it's because some say it could really be as high as 20%. That's a lot of folks. And honestly, if we're to study history and understand the mistakes of the past, well, having that many slaves means there's probably more people to join in the angry mob and the revolts, because you have slaves and people don't like that. Number 9. The act itself. I know I didn't have to tell you this, but I'm gonna tell you anyway. The act itself. Now, just an idea, and this is gonna make some corporate overlords faint, but when I say this, maybe we shouldn't put our fellow man in chains and shackles and be forced to complete hard labor for no wage and they're treated like dirt. Just an idea. Less than dirt, actually, sometimes. Look, I know sometimes we as humans don't get along. As a Canadian, playing hockey in school always changed my behavior. I think Chris would agree with this too. We could be the sweetest students ever, but when we get out of that rink, something changes. You start seeing Stanley Cups and Maple Leafs, and probably a forced deal with a very popular coffee shop chain. But all that seething Canadian rage never made me want to treat people the way slaves were treated. What I'm getting at is, even at our worst, we would never do that. I wouldn't do that, Chris wouldn't do that, we're not gonna do that. Number 8. Work to work. I guess one slightly good thing about being a Roman slave is that, well, if you could even call a good thing in that, really, is that there was a chance to work for your freedom. Literally slaving away in the hot Roman sun for years just so you can get your freedom, so you can work and sweat in the hot Roman sun for years for very little pay. Not so great when you put it that way. I hope there's a sunscreen budget. Some slaves could buy their freedom, some were freed by their masters, and getting freed was actually a big deal, as there was sometimes a ceremony where a slave and then a public official would touch the head of the slave of the staff. Abracadabra, alakazam, wishy-washy, sloshy, poof. Magic, you're free now. So simple, right? Almost like it didn't have to happen in the first place. Huh?
In our number 7 spot today, we have the Jij Rebellion. By the time the 19th century rolled around, slavery was a large part of the economy in Cape Colony, which was a region of South Africa under British rule that was quickly developing. Among the enslaved populations in this area, there were several uprising attempts, but the largest and most famous, and really one of the first organized revolts in the colony, came in 1808, and it is referred to as the Jij Rebellion. Basically, there were about 340 slaves, mainly from grain farms, that came together, and while their efforts were largely non-violent, they took over farms, imprisoned the owners, and freed the slaves. They aimed to march on Cape Town, and they were successful, but only for a while. Within 36 hours, all of the main leaders of the revolt were either sentenced to death or imprisoned, which led to the revolt sort of breaking down. While they didn't achieve their larger goals, this uprising did go on to strengthen the voices across Cape Colony that were beginning to speak up and out, and this eventually led to the abolition of slavery in the 1830s. In our number 6 spot today, we have Gaspar Yanga's Rebellion. Often referred to as the quote first liberator of the Americas, Gaspar Yanga was a slave who went on to spend 4 decades establishing a free settlement in Mexico. This story starts off in 1570 when there was a staged revolt at a sugarcane plant near Veracruz. Gaspar and a small group fled into the forest and began to establish their own colony. They would go on to spend the next 40 years hiding in this outlaw community, and they survived by farming and also the occasional raid on Spanish supply convoys. In 1609, colonial authorities did succeed in destroying their settlement, but they failed to capture Gaspar or his followers. As 40 years had passed, Gaspar was now in his old age, and he negotiated his right to build his own colony as long as he paid taxes to the Spanish crown. I mean, that seems like a pretty fair negotiation to me. This municipality, which was the first official settlement of freed Africans in the Americas, was fully established in 1630, and it still exists today. It is called Yanga. In our number 5 spot today, we have Nat Turner's Rebellion. This remains one of the most famous slave revolts in American history, and it happened in 1831. This uprising, led by Nat Turner, occurred in Southampton County, Virginia, and it began when Nat, who was a deeply religious person, planned it after having experienced prophetic visions which ordered him to gain his freedom using force. On August 21st, 1831, Nat and a group killed the family of those who enslaved them, and from there a group of about 70 moved from house to house, taking lives as they went. It took a militia to take down this group, but it did happen when Nat and 55 others were captured and sentenced to death by the state. This rebellion is said to have had a ripple effect that created hysteria among white people and slave owners. Somewhere around an estimated 200 slaves were eventually killed by white mobs. This is obviously horrific enough, but this is not where it ended. Nat Turner was regarded as quite an intelligent man, and this was cited as a major factor in his revolt, and of course enslavers wanted to try and ensure it never happened again. This meant that many states later went on to pass laws which made it illegal to teach black people how to read or write. In our number 4 spot today, we have the Haitian Revolution. Widely regarded as the most successful slave rebellion in history, this revolution began as a revolt, but ended with the founding of an independent state. In 1791, the main part of the uprising began in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, and it was inspired by the egalitarian philosophy of the French Revolution. Those revolting organized their plans and ended up killing people, burning sugar plantations, all in the pursuit and journey of taking control of the northern regions of Saint-Domingue. This would last for years until February of 1794, when the government abolished slavery in all of its territories. In 1801, famed rebel general Toussaint Louverture joined forces with the French Republicans, and in this year he had established himself as the governor of the island. This all changed again, however, in 1802, when Napoleon Bonaparte's imperial forces captured the general and attempted to reinstate slavery. The former slaves were not having this, and they quickly took up arms. Led by Jean-Jacques Dessalines in 1803, they defeated the French forces at the Battle of Vertières. The year after this, the former slaves declared their independence and they established the island as the new Republic of Haiti. The success of this story quickly spread and went on to inspire others to revolt throughout the United States and the Caribbean.
Number 3, the bathhouse. I didn't think this was going to be a secret to anyone, but the slaves weren't just working in the fields or putting up some arches that last longer than most marriages. No, some poor folks had the duty of polishing pearls, smoking the salami, waxing the carrot, and finger fishing for clams. I think you get my point. Yes, the oldest profession in the world, however, it wasn't exactly a profession in this case, more like it had to be done or there would be consequences. Eek. For me, brothels might sound great on paper, but when you're laying down in the doctor's office and he's trying to scrape barnacles off your piece of deal, well, I can't say I didn't warn you. Number 2, gladiators. Guys, I actually learned something today. I know, right? Imagine little old me learning something. Gladiators, you know them, you love them. The movie is okay in my opinion. The warriors who duked it out in the Roman Colosseum weren't always brought in chains. Some were volunteers actually. Honestly, as I was writing this, I thought to myself, well, gosh darn it there, feller. If that don't sound like that's the Hunger Games. That's right, being dragged away from your family and forced to fight in blood sport. All you're missing is Donald Sutherland's buttery smooth voice. I also can't help myself in mentioning this, but probably the first battle royale ever too. So maybe it's just a part of us. Something about the last man standing that we love so much, and why I want to spend all my savings on Fortnite skins. Number 1, thumbs up, very nice. Listen, we've all seen the movie. Joaquin Phoenix is standing there looking all Roman-like and looking into the heart of Russell Crowe, knowing damn well this will probably be his last blockbuster. That's just how it goes. There, in suspense, the audience waits to see what his thumbs do to decide his fate. Well, this is true of the Roman slaves in the Colosseum, however, there's a couple things that differ from the movie. One, being not all who went into battle perished, and two, the thumbs down might be what you want, actually, not the thumbs up. Meaning that the thumbs up meant yes, go ahead and finish the plebeian. A thumbs down, a fist, or even waving a cloth might have meant no, spare the poor soul, have mercy. All I know is that I do not volunteer as tribute. Sorry, Prim.